Tim Altenhof, who will present us the Factory-as-Chimney. It means industrial architecture by Mendelsohn, certainly. A few words about the speaker. Tim Altenhof is an architect and university assistant at the University of Innsbruck. If I'm not mistaken, defended his PhD thesis at Yale University. Tim is, and he received Bruno Zevi Prize in 2018 for the work concerning Mendelsohn. Tim is an international fellow at the Institute for Advanced Study and in the Humanities in Essen, where he is preparing the next interesting publication. Tim?
I will, instead of giving you account of the entire Luckenwalde head factory, which really has been widely published, I will rather give you what I think is a prehistory to the building, so trying to embed Mendelsohn's work in particular, not the entire head factory, but more precisely the die works within a broader discourse around that time. So the cursors do the job. Okay, so one of modern architecture's most dramatic roofs had a short lifespan. Daring in its outline, the roof of Erich Mendelsohn's famous die works at Luckenwalde, a photo many of you will know, was erected in 1921 and torn down in 1935 after the head factory was taken over by a machine building company largely controlled by the German Air Force and under the direction of Göring. This is a historic photo. Transforming what was once a head factory into a war plant also resulted in the removal of its most prominent element, the trapezoidal roof, which would have been too easy a target for future air raids. Just 2 years later, in 1937, Mendelsohn heaped his projects into a mound, an ink drawing of which exists at the Kunstbibliothek in Berlin. In fact, his buildings in aggregate amounted to an entire mountain village of considerable size, crowned by the famous Einstein Tower. Whether this structure simply lent itself to becoming the crown, or whether Mendelsohn sought to give it a particular significance, still in 1925, it might have been Luckenwalde at the very top of a similar drawing. You can actually spot it center left. That year, that is in 1925, Julius Posener and his students visited Mendelsohn's office in Berlin, and when he was asked about his best building to date by one of the students, Mendelsohn replied without hesitation, Luckenwalde. I assume most of you know the structure inside out, so I will offer just a bit of context. In a way, Luckenwalde is synonymous with the head factory, Steinberg, Hermann and Co., which stands as a classical modernist masterpiece in a small town some 40 miles south of Berlin. I realize everything is in American because I work on a manuscript, so it's not in the metric system, but that is not so important. Luckenwalde had long become the cradle of German head fashion. The town witnessed an increase in textile and metal factories from the mid-19th century onwards, and in 1871 the first company adapted its production from textiles to hats. For long, the German hat producer Friedrich Steinberg vied with Gustav Hermann, one of Mendelsohn's early patrons, for the best hat designs, but after merging their companies, they commissioned Mendelsohn to devise a new manufacturing plant on an empty lot on the outskirts of town. It became one of the paradigmatic expressions for an industry of the future, with critics like Adolf Behne pointing out the functional layout and its compelling translation into a tight spatial form. At the center, which you see here on the side plan, 4 manufacturing sheds are framed by the die works in the south and a power station, which we just saw also in Achim's presentation. And at the bottom, right next to the street, you can also see the small gatehouse. The factory's die house, with its shaft-like hood, recreated the outline of a head, while at the same time funneling through the roof the toxic fumes accruing inside. It was this feature in particular that ultimately led to a follow-up in Leningrad, the so-called Krasnoye Znamya, or Red Banner Factory. There is actually in Carsten's recent Birkhäuser publication also a cross-section, which I hadn't seen before. In the summer of 1925, following Mendelsohn's visit to the Engadin, where he spent some time with Louise, he received a phone call from the Russian trade mission declaring their interest in the hat factory. 2 days later, on a warm Sunday in August, Mendelsohn made a day trip to Luckenwalde to prepare for a first meeting. He went swimming in the morning and lost his glasses, which could only be retrieved from the lake's grounds through prolonged dives by his friends. Finally commissioned in October that same year, then in 1925, Erich traveled to Moscow and Leningrad together with Louise, where both went to visit all the monuments. This is all well documented in the correspondence. Louise found the stay in Leningrad particularly, and I quote, exhilarating, and for lunch she often relished caviar and vodka. Her memoirs recall the circumstances that led to the contract in Leningrad, a passage worth quoting at length. So this is Louise now speaking. Among the most fascinating people who came to his office were a group of Russians. Their purpose was to receive information about the dye works, which were part of the Luckenwalde hat factory built in 1921. When Erich received the commission to build the hat factory, he carefully studied the manufacturing process and became appalled by the working conditions of the laborers. The steam of the dye vats permeated the whole shed, in spite of large exhaust fans, which only caused a strong draft and afflicted a large number of workmen with pneumonia. Erich found an excellent solution to this problem, which became widely published in industrial magazines and must have come to the attention of the Russians, who planned to build a large textile factory. The principle on which Erich solved the problem of achieving a dry white shed was a very simple one. He constructed a chimney-like hood over the dye vats and upper arches into which the steam was exhausted. This created a chimney over the whole length of the building and effected constant and uniform air exchange. Erich led the Russians through the entire factory, and they were sufficiently impressed to offer him the commission to build a textile factory with 3 dye vats close to Leningrad. Planning a large complex of building for Russia, a rather enigmatic country and unknown to most Europeans, excited not only Erich but the whole office. A day was set for bringing the plans to Leningrad, and the work in the office extended into the midnight hour. Bach records were played, inexhaustible quantities of coffee were provided, the atmosphere was pregnant with creation. We left for Leningrad in the fall of 1925, 1 year after Lenin's death. The textile factory was going to be built outside of Leningrad and combined a power station, 3 dye works, an administration building, and the actual factory. One can sense the complexities involved in building such a big structure in a country hardly known. Yet the mood here is cheerful. There is a sense of excitement, but also stress, with architects drinking too much coffee while listening to Bach. Yet, what is striking about this anecdote is Louise's emphasis on 2 things. Similar factories around that time had been stricken spaces in which workers developed pneumonia, an inflammation of the lungs. And the architectural response to this was a simple one. Mendelsohn turned the dye works into a chimney. So what was actually going inside? The production of hats required workers to dye felt or wool, a process releasing poisonous fumes which in turn caused high humidity levels inside. And here I'm actually not sure, that is one of the photos I found in a compilation by Thomas Drachenberg. It doesn't look like the interior of Luckenwalde, so something is off. Okay, but you get the idea. The principle, I think, is still well illustrated. As a result, the warm, moist air affected the workers' lungs as well as the materials, and it also impeded interior visibility, which further complicated the work process. Previously, architects employed smokestacks, fans, or pressurized air to attenuate the emergence of fog. But these measures created only new conditions, such as draft and an inexcessive temperature rise. Stacks alone were too exposed to the fluctuation of outside temperatures and simply furthered the condensation of steam. By contrast, fans were either too weak or produced too much turbulence inside. Mechanical ventilation was of little help. Apparently, Mendelsohn was the first architect to come up with a solution, relieving the nuisance of poisonous fumes without creating side effects, often more harmful than the waste steam one sought to get rid of in the first place. How was this accomplished? One could facilitate the necessary air exchange by dint of negative air pressure, something Mendelsohn discovered by mere happenstance. According to John Berlowitz, a contemporary and Berlin-based engineer, Mendelsohn ran into a still operating dye factory whose, and here I quote, accidentally kept smokestack had the ability to defog the interior. Ultimately, a serendipitous discovery paired with architectural knowledge and years of research into primitive facilities enabled Mendelsohn to devise this structure. Berlowitz, the engineer, called it Schlotbau in German, in essence a chimney structure. Where previous designs brought about rising temperatures and draft, side effects which further exacerbated the condition of lungs already distressed by the toxic fumes, at Luckenwalde the interior was completely free of fog, even when the facility ran at full capacity with 24 dye tubs. For Berlowitz, it was the design itself, a response through architectural form, rather than building technologies, that really fixed the issue. That's a translation I did, quoting from the newspaper. As far as we know, it was the Berlin-based architect who managed for the very first time to build a dye works that, despite its large dimensions, has completely resolved the problem of defogging. Only the insight that the building itself, that is its cross-section, the arrangement of windows and ventilation ducts, would have to enhance the natural buoyancy of the steam from the outset, was a major step forward. At a height of 7 feet, just above the workers' heads, outlets for preheated compressed air enhanced the buoyancy force active inside the dye works so that air could be completely changed in just 1 hour. The account of Berlowitz is in line with that of Louise. Primitive or simple, the solution came in the form of a chimney. Most scholarship on Luckenwalde refers to the dye house as a kind of invention. In 1956, Arnold Wittig describes it, and I have a slew of quotations now, describes it as an entirely new type which Mendelsohn invented. Sigrid Achenbach in 1987 notes a novel ventilation system. In 1997, Kathleen James Chakraborty sees in the dye works a significant technical innovation, and only 1 year later, Regina Stephan writes about an entirely new functional principle. Yet another year later, Bruno Sevi alludes to a special ventilation system that Mendelsohn invented. While Kathleen James points to a few references for Luckenwalde, Josef Olbrich's gatehouse to a Darmstadt exhibition, a factory by Hans Pölzig, Bruno Sevi remarks that Mendelssohn's copious precedents were so diverse that they finally ended in smoke. It's just too many that it's pointless to actually point them out. Published in 1992, a Bauwelt article suggests that Mendelssohn's design for the dye works was obviously influenced by Albert Kahn's industrial exhaust stacks, and that Kahn, the great industrial architect from the United States, was a frequent guest at the Rupenhorn estate. I'm not exactly sure what to make of this conjunction, not least because the Rupenhorn house was only built years later. Kahn is mentioned for the first time in 1942 in the correspondence between Erich and Louise. I found this one photo, which could have perhaps been a precedent for the ventilating, for the vents in the sheds, not in the dye works. But nor am I sure what to make of the invention posited by previous scholarship. Today I want to draw our attention to a cutaway section reminiscent of the dye works. Whether Mendelsohn knew this drawing is unknown to me. It is included in Philibert Delorme's 1567 architectural treatise, Le Premier Tome de l'Architecture. As a French architect and writer, Delorme instructed the master builders of the French Renaissance both in the general layout of schemes as much as in the different ways of assembling them. In this manual, a woodcut shows an abstract kitchen, the walls of which are 10 to 12 feet high and perforated by apertures. Far above door height, the walls bend inwards, yielding a cross-section not unlike that of Luckenwalde. Here, the two converging lines lead to something Delorme calls a lantern or chimney pipe. This lantern is 4 times narrower than the kitchen and open towards the surroundings by virtue of 3 narrow vents in each wall, quickly dissipating the smoke that develops below. A small circumferential wall running around these vents offers protection against the wind, while at the same time facilitating an upflow of smoke. A small cupola at the very top follows the same principle. Here, a double-layered shell is perforated in order to release the smoke. Was this the blueprint for Luckenwalde? Rendered in brick, its outline and general proportion make it something of an unconscious archetype for what I call the house as chimney. A related discourse arose alongside chimneys, fireplaces and furnaces throughout the long 19th century, when all kinds of social and health reformers, educators and engineers, as well as experimental hygienists and physiologists promoted ideas on ventilation. In today's paper, I cannot rehearse this discourse, but briefly want to dwell on the house's chimney. Interior spaces of the 19th century were seen to be imbued with vitiated air, often acting as air traps. In his 1844 study on the English working class, Friedrich Engels condemned the overcrowded dwellings of the poor. So this is one of the first instances where someone makes an observation on the poor air quality inside. As though the vitiated atmosphere of the streets were not enough, they are penned, the workers, in dozens into single rooms, so that the air which they breathe at night is enough in itself to stifle them. Their houses are so built that the clammy air cannot escape. Not only the polluted atmosphere posed a threat to urban dwellers. The dominant debates on the theory of ventilation were rather anthropocentric. Breathing human beings acted as the major polluter, vitiating the air inside through respiration and perspiration. This is why the American expert on ventilation, Louis Leeds, wrote in 1896, and here I quote, that man's own breath is his greatest enemy. Here, ventilation was not imperative because humans inhale air, but rather because they exhale it. A remedy for these toxic interiors was what I call the leaky house. It promised relief by facilitating constant atmospheric exchange. The leaky house is simply the opposite of the closed worlds we know of today, buildings that seal us off from the environment, primarily on account of energy efficiency. In 1863, the German chemist Max von Pettenkofer introduced a wacky contraption to the readership of a Bavarian journal, which he called Respirationsapparat, respiration apparatus, a scientific device to establish a standard for air change rates necessary to keep a human being or animal in good health or alive. Made of sheet iron and glass, it measured 8 feet on both sides and was sealed with wax. Almost airtight, the cell featured crevices and apertures, 3 circular holes which you can see at the door. And it was because of them that Pettenkofer found this respiration space to be able to commute freely with the atmosphere. Frei mit der Atmosphäre kommunizieren. Soon, he ascribed this property to the house in general. In a series of lectures published in 1872, Pettenkofer claimed that no more than our clothing ought the house to be a contrivance for excluding us from the outside air. Human bodies need a steady flow of surrounding air, and tightly enclosed homes prevent a connection with the atmosphere. As mechanical ventilation was still uncommon for dwellings, the stack effect was a common theme. And because of temperature differences occurring between inside and outside, Pettenkofer claimed that leaky houses, in very broad terms, just act like large chimneys, because wind is always occurring, there are always temperature differences, has to do with physics. If natural ventilation was good, resulting drafts were bad. The flow of air should remain imperceptible, because Pettenkofer and contemporaries in allied fields considered drafts unhealthy. Draft disturbs the body temperature merely on one side and poses a danger to health. Pettenkofer was not alone with these observations, and the Hungarian physician Josef Fodor, for instance, soon promoted similar ideas. Here are some cross-sections, for instance. This is all what I consider the house as chimney. There are different variations, but you also see from different countries. It's not just a discourse that is related to Germany, it also appears in the United Kingdom, in the United States, but there are many of these drawings emerging from the mid-19th century onwards. Here is another one actually by Woodbridge. So to be sure, at Luckenwalde it wasn't the workers who rendered the air impure, but the dye vats that produced toxic fumes. And still the structure in many ways was the architectural reification of this 19th century discourse on ventilation. It implemented most of its central tenets. The dye works produced a draft-free environment. The interior communicated with the outside atmosphere. The house functioned as a chimney, and it protected workers from contracting pneumonia, that inflammatory condition of the lung affecting the small air sacs known as alveoli. If there is one organ to be associated with modern architecture, it is perhaps the human lung, not least because of tuberculosis, one of the deadliest diseases around the turn of the 20th century and in fact still today. Lungs often appeared in publications across the board, cultural, scientific, but also architectural. There are, for instance, drawings of lungs and pulmonary alveoli in the American Women's Home by the Beecher sisters, as well as in many publications by Le Corbusier. Here you see a sketch, Le Poumon. There is another one spread here from 1933. Otto Neurath made illustrations of lungs, and so did Fritz Kahn in his infographics popular in Weimar, Germany. The building's history after 1935 is one of many transformations, and following German reunification it fell into oblivion until, in the early 2000s, major efforts to breathe life into the structure led to its successful reconstruction. Yet despite many different stakeholders investing millions of euros in funding, there still seems to be no vision for a future use. In 2012, the structure was up for sale on the internet, as you can see in the next slide. So the owner offered it for 2.2 million euros. And its current ownership is unknown to me. I was in touch with the mayor of Luckenwalde, but it's information they don't want to reveal or they cannot reveal. These days, a nearby metal processing company rents the former production sheds as a storage unit for materials, which you can see on the right-hand side. It's a photograph from February. Inside the former dye works, artificial flowers in glowing orange and pale pink arise from wooden boxes, perhaps a symbol of resilience. They also increase one's sensation of an abandoned interior. For me, Luckenwalde is such a powerful structure because it is deeply rooted in architectural history, and consciously or not. But it is such a modern structure at the same time because it reflected a much broader sensitivity to issues of breathing and to the vulnerability of lungs. The architectural solution was simple, perhaps even primitive. It was a chimney. Yet the rationale behind the structure was highly contemporary. Whether it was an invention, I would love to discuss with you. Thank you.